event since this is our first remotely attended city council retreat. There's all sorts of history being made all the time these days, and this is no exception. For those who might be following remotely and don't know me otherwise, I'm Steve Peifel. I'm usually the city attorney, but my role today is to be the facilitator just to help guide the conversation among the council for this council retreat. The purpose of today's retreat primarily is to provide the council and staff with some groundwork information for purposes of budget preparations, which will be coming up in the fall, and to kind of give everybody an understanding of where things stand currently. And I think we've got everybody present on council. The one downside we have to these Zoom meetings is that it's a little bit harder than when we're in person for me to know when someone wants to comment or has something that they'd like to say. So I'd like you all to be as diligent as possible about giving me a warning by either raising your hand or just like we were in person, or using the raise hand function that's available on Zoom, or the chat function that's on Zoom. Any of those three should work. We also don't have a parking lot today, but I'd ask you all to take some notes if there's anything that you think about during the context of the meeting that's not quite on topic at that point in time. Make a note of it, and then there will be time at the end. We'll cover any miscellaneous council item issues that we want to discuss in the context of that those thoughts. We do have a couple of other items at the end that we'll talk about that council members have raised. Otherwise, I think the usual rules apply. We want everyone to contribute and everyone to speak up and speak clearly, because we're on a Zoom meeting. We want to make sure that we don't speak more than one at a time, and make sure that when you do speak, you're no longer on mute, and that your microphones are on. So everybody okay with those ground rules? Normally, I take this time to kind of go around the room and ask the council what they're hoping to accomplish with the retreat. I think I'm going to forego that given the format of the meeting, but I'll ask the question, does anybody have any initial comments they want to make before we get started with the staff presentation? I'm not seeing a show of hands at the moment, so I think we might as well get right into it. I'm going to hand this off now to Paul and Kristen Garcia. And if you have questions during the presentation, I think they're prepared to answer your questions just as we would in a regular live session. We're all together. So raise your hand or somehow notify them that you've got a question, and we'll try to get those answered as we go along this afternoon. So Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Council, Mayor, and Directors for spending this sunny afternoon on our April retreat, postponed just slightly. Really interesting. Steve's right. We're setting some new history today. We're doing our first remote retreat together. We've postponed this since April. This is normally our April retreat. We've postponed it all the way to just about the last day of July in the hopes that we could get together face to face and talk through this. And of course, that's not the reality today. We're just getting used to doing this by Zoom. The other change that you'll notice that's kind of disappointing to me, but it is part of where we're at today, is that our April retreat is generally that time where we get to work together and come up with the goals. The council sets some priorities for the city for the next couple of years as we're building the budget, and staff takes those priorities and creates a work plan, and we develop a budget and we bring it back to the council in the fall for your consideration. A little bit different this year just because things have changed a lot since March, when we really started learning about this new COVID-19 that's consumed our lives in more ways than one since then. And the biggest effect that we're going to be talking about today is how it can affect us financially for the city, and the precautions that we're going to take to work through that. And I don't want it to be all gloom and doom. I'll start out when we get through the slides. You'll hear that what we're going to talk about is a hold the line budget. We have actually, we run really lean, as you all know that. We don't have a great deal of discretionary spending to begin with. Most of our general fund money goes towards non-discretionary items. So we have very little to play with before we start talking about, reduced services. Now, having said that, as we talk through this, we'll have opportunities if we're trying to err on the side of conservative budgeting here and make sure that we don't get ourselves into a position where we get to that deep into our reserve fund and not be able to recover. That doesn't mean that we can't change down the road. So the conversations that Kristen and I have been having is that we're going to present this as a hold the line budget for right now. If revenues look good when we get to springtime next year and our spring retreat, we'll be able to go back and look at some program requests and prioritize if we have the revenues there to support it. So the first page on your presentation that I sent out via email, or I should actually say Wendy sent out, are the 3 strategic priorities that council developed 2 years ago when we had our budget, or our goal building retreat. And that's public safety, addressing the public safety needs of our community, fiscal sustainability, that's developing a budget and a 10-year outlook that we know that we have a viable financial plan, and economic development, attracting investment, housing, and jobs for our community. Those were the 3 overarching priorities that council set 2 years ago. Staff created a work plan based on that. And in the back of the presentation I sent you is our normal quarterly update, which is a few weeks late, but I thought it was appropriate to have it here at the retreat. That just shows you where we're at on all of those priority projects that we developed to support those. And again, those are not holistic of everything that staff does in the city. It just lists some of those items that support those strategic priorities of council. As we move into the development of the 21-22 budget, on your next slide, some of the considerations that we have in place: no new discretionary spending. So this is, like I said, a hold the line budget at this point. Assumption, we did assume fire and EMS expenses for both 2021 and 2022. I bring that up just because we are talking about potential for a RFA with North County Fire. We'll talk more about the budget impacts of that later in the presentation, but if that annexation is approved and moves forward, that would be right in the middle of our biennial budget. So what we are moving forward with this biennial budget is to assume the expenses of fire and EMS in both 2021 and 2022 at this point. However, if the annexation goes through, we'll be doing budget amendments for 2022 to remove those revenues and expenses from the 2022 budget to true it up. Does that make sense to everybody? That's in lieu of trying to do 2 budgets simultaneously that one wouldn't come true. Maintain sufficient reserve funds. We'll also touch on that a little bit deeper as we move through the presentation. But it's our goal to maintain our mandatory reserve funds. Some of the economic indicators that we look at to make those judgment calls on what our budget's going to look like and our revenue assumptions are sales tax trends. We've seen, as Kristen just gave earlier this week, our financial report, and council's aware that so far our sales tax trends have been positive. However, we also know that there's the spending habits are a little bit different than what they've been in the past. So that concerns us that it might have just been some impulse buying that have kept those numbers at a steady rate. We also look at permit revenues and the amount of permits coming in, employment rates regionally and statewide, property values, and some of the major regional influences, such as, industry trends. So those are the things we look at to try to predict how our revenues are going to come in, if we're going to see an uptick or a reduction in revenues. On the next slide, state shared revenues. This is another concern that we look at, and we wanted to just bring this to council's attention, is that we do rely on state shared revenues. Those are items that we get funding that is funneled through the state. In our 2020 budget, our total state shared revenue was $917,620. 487,000 was general fund, and 430,000 was street fund. So no insignificant number. Down below is a percentage of how that's broke out in fuel tax, liquor tax, PUD, criminal justice, and marijuana. We'll touch on that a little bit more again as we kind of go through the slides. These initial slides will kind of build on each other as we move through the presentation. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we have the significant amount of our general fund budget is non-discretionary items. When I say non-discretionary, I mean those are items that we don't have a lot of control over the costs on. They're influenced by something outside of us, and that reductions in those areas have an impact on the level of service that we provide to the community. So we listed some of those. It's not probably missed some, but our collecting bargaining agreements have adjustments in there that are non-discretionary and affect our budget. Voter and registration costs, general increases in supplies and fuel have a significant increase on our budget, or can. Public safety, this is always a concern. Jail costs, prosecution, and public defense are rates that climb every year, and represent a significant piece of our budget. Those three items alone are about $1.5 million a year out of our general fund budget. We also have contracts for different services or that we pay into that are population based. So since we're looking at about a 4% population increase between 2019 and 2020, then that's an example of those numbers carrying forward. Since it's population based, we'll see again increases in those contract amounts. So this is like DEM and services such as that. On the next slide is actions already taken. So we talked about this being a hold the line budget. In March, April, when we realized the potential impacts of the pandemic, I worked with the directors, Kristen and I, to make some emergency adjustments to the budget to reflect a 10% overall decrease in the general fund budget. And I wanted to point out, we talked about the difference to the discretionary versus non-discretionary funds. And so traditionally, and this number is not something to hold dear, but just in general, about 90% of the general fund is non-discretionary, and about 10% is discretionary. So when we talk about making a 10% reduction in the general fund budget, such as what we did this year, means you're really cutting out your discretionary funding right away. So any additional decreases in the budget, you start getting into those non-discretionary items. So we suspended all mandatory training, all non-mandatory training, excuse me, meaning that the only training that we're doing with staff right now is mandatory or that has to do with maintaining a professional license or certification. We suspended all travel except for what absolutely has to occur. Non-essential supplies have been reduced. We eliminated a shared administrative position. We were able to do that without a layoff. We had a retirement within the finance department. Kurt retired from the city, and so we shuffled some employees around to fill that position, and then eliminated the shared administrative position, but moved that employee into an open seat that occurred from that vacancy. We're delaying the hiring of a vacant M&O position. That position became vacant due to retirement, and we're not going to fill that until we are confident that we have revenues to support that. Also delaying the hiring of the vacant communication manager position. That was a position vacated by an employee who left the city. And we won't fill that again until we have sufficient funding to be sure we can support that. Also have a hiring freeze on, so we're not going to hire any non-essential employees if openings occur at this point. And again, I don't want to go through this too fast and miss anything. So if you have questions as I go through it, please don't hesitate to ask.
Michelle has a question.
Oh, Michelle?
You're on mute, Michelle.
So Paul, do we know what we've saved so far with the actions that have already been taken?
The actions that have been taken in it is a 10% of the overall general fund budget. This was kind of a mid-year because we started this in April, May, and so it really doesn't you don't see the full effect until the beginning of the second quarter. So it's a 20% reduction as the directors look at, because it's the last half of their budget that they're taking that out of, but it's 10% of the overall annual budget.
Thank you. You might have already said that and I missed it, so sorry.
Okay.
Deborah has
Deborah?
Back to the state shared revenues.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious, and I'm sure you guys don't know the answer and you can just send it to us later, but I'm wondering what our loss was of state shared revenues with the Great Recession. So say 2010 and 2011, just to kind of see as we progress in this year.
You know what, we'll try to pull that out and send it to you in a dollar amount. I don't have that. When we get a couple of slides down, we're going to talk about that in greater detail, because we did see some sweeping of shared revenues. And so I have some slides later on that you may have seen that show some impacts to that, just some what if scenarios to give council some places to think about. And so I did want to point out that we did see some sweeping of shared revenues from the state. And it did have an impact on our budget.
So two things that I think are important to remember there, that these are going to be actions that will come out of the state legislative session next year. And then we react to those impacts, but the state's budget operates at a different time frame than ours. We're January to December, they're July through June. So if they make a decision in the session early in the spring, that'll take effect July 1st. So it will impact the second half of that first year budget for us.
It just helps me historically to have some of that information. So like I said, I didn't expect you to have it on hand, but it would be just helpful to know.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get that for you. Make sure it gets out to everybody. On the next slide, I just want to talk about reserve funds, because it's always when we're in this position where we see the potential or we see revenues decreasing and we're it's much easier to budget when you're in a good economy than budget when you're in a bad economy. And so it's when you start in or you anticipate a bad economy, then you really start looking at reserve funds and going, boy, I wish, do we have enough? When you're looking at a bad economy, the answer is always no, you never have enough. But I did want to show some examples here because, the idea of the reserve fund is to give us enough, rainy day money there to be able to make course corrections in the organization to get us to operate within our means. And of course, the larger an organization gets, the harder it is to steer that ship and make those course corrections all at once. So currently, our ending fund balance within the general fund is equal to 1 month's operating expenses. So it's $1.527 million. To date, that's where we're at in that fund. And just wanted to show if it was at 2 months, we would be at 3.1 million, which is, as we look at some different scenarios, you'll see that is of course much more favorable when you're looking at how fast those reserve funds can deplete. The same with the mandatory reserve fund. Our mandatory reserve fund council did change it from a flat 8% to a range between 8 and 16%. And so, that has helped. At 8%, which is what we have as a mandatory minimum, 1.1 million. And if it was at 16%, it would be 2.2 million. So so you can keep those in mind as we move forward through some what if scenarios, which starts on the next page. So what if sales tax revenues were decreased by 20%? This would be a $1.1 million hit, and I'm just using round numbers. You have the figures there. If we had a 20% decrease in our sales tax, that would hit our $1.5 million reserve and leave us with $396,000 in our reserve fund. So as you can see, that just gives you some context to what decreases in the revenue does and how quickly we have to make course corrections. If sales class was to decline by 50%, that'd be 2.9 million, which would actually put us $244,000 in the red. So we'd use up all of our reserve fund and be 244,000 in the red. On the next page, we talk a little bit about the state shared revenues, just to give some examples on that. So what if the reduction in our liquor and our marijuana excise tax was decreased by 50%? And it kind of shows you the mathematics on a $150,000 hit to our general fund. The next one, I circled this one and wanted to, because I thought this was probably one of the ones that was something that we could see based on historical information. Like I said, we did have, the state did sweep state shared revenues during the downturn in the economy of 2008. And it was an impact to our budget. So what if the state eliminated the liquor and marijuana distributions, that's $300,000 worth of revenue into our general fund, which would reduce our reserve fund by the $300,000. And as you can see, leave us with 1.2 million. So it just takes us down a little bit and gives us a less money to work with.
Can we have Kristen just talk really just shortly about the impacts of when we don't meet our financial policies with our reserve, what the impacts are to the city?
Well, one of the things, I guess audit's kind of on my mind. So one of the things that's really important is when the auditors come in, they look at a couple of different things. So we have financial policies, and those are established as kind of a financial framework to protect us in situations like this to make sure that we can maintain ourselves as a sustainable entity. So financial policies are very important. Auditors do look at that to make sure that we are maintaining those policies, and the expectation would be if we're not meeting those policies that we would put a plan into place to show how we're going to get back to meeting those policies. Another thing that auditors look at, which I think is important for any industry, whether it's government or private sector, is that we want to make sure that we're hitting our benchmarks. They look at what's called a going concern. They look at different financial ratios, what your fund balance levels are those meeting policies? What do those trends look like? What's your economic outlook in terms of what's happening in your community? What's your debt to equity ratio? So all these different financial formulas to make sure that you are again, a viable entity going forward. In addition to the auditors, as we know, as we went through the bond process, it's very important when we're issuing bonds that the rating companies also look at that information. So there is a lot of different places that are looking how well we are performing financially, not only internally to make sure that we can provide the services that we're committing to our community to provide, but also external forces are looking at those to make sure that we can meet the demands of the community and that we are financially sustainable. So did that help address, Barb, what you were?
Yeah, I just wanted a brief overview. I thought that was great. Thank you.
Any questions as we go through this?
I have one. So Kristen, since all the cities in the state are going to be facing or are facing exactly what we are, doesn't that mean that the auditors are going to look at things just a little bit different than what they would normally? I mean, we're in an entirely different time and everyone's going to have problems with finances and with sales tax. And if the state does come back and cut stuff that's already coming to us, won't they look at things a little differently?
I won't say that they will look at things differently. I think what the expectation would be is what are we as an organization doing to mitigate the impacts that we are seeing from this situation. So what they would expect to see is that if our revenues are declining, that we have the internal controls or the processes to understand and recognize when that's happening. And then what are we doing about it? What plans are we putting into place to make sure that we can get through that and not getting into a place where we're, going bankrupt or we have $0 in the bank. That's not where we're headed, but they would expect for us to be able to recognize what's happening and then put a plan into place to mitigate that. Not that they don't expect our revenues wouldn't decrease, because obviously that's something that we can't control, but if they are, how are we handling that?
Okay, thank you.
Deborah?
So my question, and I've talked with Paula a little bit about this I think in March when all this first started, and Kristen too, but is it possible for us to really look at our reserve policy? And I know we're heading into probably, a downtrend, even though we haven't quite seen it yet, but it's not too late, right? For us to rethink our policy to possibly increase it to like 2 months reserve.
I think, now we wouldn't, I think we do want to increase it. I think, I know we'd want to increase it. What I don't want to do is put us increases to something that we can't accomplish in a downturned economy and then be out of compliance with our policies. But we've established a range, and I think we should work towards that, getting to the top end of that range and look at extending these reserve fund balances up a little bit as we can afford to do that.
Well,
so that we do have a better.
Go ahead.
So we do have a better model, and I'll skip just to the next slide really quick, and then we can flip back. But since we're talking about that, is that we just put in here the use of reserve funds. So our policy allows for the use of reserve funds to address temporary shortfalls in our revenues. Our policy requires that administration come to council within 60 days of using those reserve funds with a plan on how to restore them. Thank you. Tongue tied there for. And so Kristen and I and the mayor, we talked about this and put it in here just so that council understood how it worked with the reserve fund, and then to show that to be able to talk about the commitment to our reserve fund being a priority. So in the event we do have to dip into our reserve funds during a downturn in the economy, it's very important to the administration that we make that a priority to establish a process to repay it. So as our revenues go up, we want to be able to have a process to restore our reserve funds before we start spending money on other things. So before we start looking at adding programs, we at least want to have a plan in place of how we bring our reserve funds up at the same time, because that is important to the organization. And you may see a little dip in the economy that forces you to dip into your reserve funds a little bit. If you restore those or build them up, great, you're ready for the next one. If you don't have a plan in place, if you end up in a economy like we can be facing right now, where it's not a recession is a deep dive, and then you're building your revenues back up. The economy is coming back over time. This is something that we have never experienced before in our lifetimes. Is a pandemic. It's something completely different, and we can see that the cases started going down, and we started to reopen the economy, and then the cases went up, and now we're backing off and creating more social distance, which is going to affect our economy. So in my opinion, I think for the pandemic, we can see a completely different scenario over time where rather than our economy dipping and then coming back, I could see us kind of dipping up and dipping, over time. So my concern would be is if we dip into our reserve fund in that first downturn and we don't have a plan in place to repay it, we dip into it a second time, how many of those can we stand before we get to that $77 number that we like to refer to from the downturn in the economy? I commit to you that, my concern and priority of, having a plan in place to replenish those reserve funds if we do end up in a position that we need to dip into them.
Yep, I really appreciate that comment. I think that what I've seen is it took a lot of effort to build our finances back up from the last recession, because we didn't have a plan to replenish them as we went. Then we entered a time of a really rip-roaring great economy, and we saw our revenues begin to increase. And I think the entire city staff and the council was hungry for investment in the city that we hadn't been able to do during the recession. And so what's happened now with the pandemic shows just how fragile situations can be. We face a whole year of unknown what the economy is going to do. And I think your questions are very prudent. Have we planned well enough? Were we, diligent enough about putting money away in order to ride the waves that we might see through whatever you call this economic period?
Well, and I feel that, we have followed the policy that we as a council have set, but I guess I'm asking for guidance, because it seems to me we need to kind of up it. And I know the timing is really critical because we don't want to lock ourselves in for failure. But I guess I'm asking for guidance with the strategic steps we need to take as a council to help you reach your goals.
So I think it's a tough conversation to have at a time when we don't think our revenues are going to increase. We think they're actually going to do the opposite.
Right.
But I do think it's an important conversation to come back to time and time again if we see this economy recover and enter back into the robust stance it was in pre-pandemic. That's absolutely a conversation. And it can even be incremental goals you set to move up over time, to raise the floor up and get closer to that ceiling.
That's what I was thinking was, can we set things incrementally and maybe start doing that in our fall retreat for the budget? Because you'll have a little bit more of a picture. So I'm just throwing out there what I've been thinking and curious, what you guys are thinking and the rest of the council.
Yeah, I would like to make it a conversation in our, especially our fall retreats when we're deciding if we do have ending fund balance money left over and we want to know where we're going to use that, is that we make the reserve fund, a priority to consider for upping that. So incrementally, we're able to raise that percentage up and just be in a better spot as we move down the road. And we know one thing for sure is the economy is going to go up and down no matter what, pandemic or not. And so, the
one-time,
yeah, it's
one-time income.
It is a good use for one-time income. And as the organization grows, we will need a wider margin to be able to make course corrections, especially with you, as you can see, we're watching the economy very closely, like right now because of the pandemic. And when you have a 2-month lag in your sales tax reports, and your sales tax is one of your major revenue streams for general fund, it makes it even more difficult to make course corrections when you're making them 2 months after the information that you're getting. Any questions on that?
Don has a question.
Don? You're muted.
Don't forget to put your mic on, Don.
You're still mute.
Sorry about that. I thought I had it unmuted. Just quick question, Paul. I see the 1.5 million that's month reserve. Is that where we were at right now, or is that a number that we're supposed to be at? I'm just curious what we are at for the 1 month reserve.
We're maintaining our reserves basically at the minimum.
At the 8%?
Yeah. Yeah. In 1 month.
You can find that on the ending fund balance down on those monthly financial sheets Kristen gives us. It's a little higher compared to the report we just went through than 1.5 in the ending fund balance.
Back to Deborah's question and stuff and her comments there, I agree that, when the times are good, if we're sitting at that 8%, we should have some type of a supplement to try to get us up to the possible 16%, where instead of waiting for acts
yeah, and those are council policies. So when we're working on that at the end of the year, when we're truing up our budget and we know what our ending fund balance looks like and stuff, that's a policy decision that council can make, where they could say, rather than saying 8 to 16%, they can say we're now at 10 to 16% or 12 to 16%, and so just raise that threshold. Like I said, it's a council policy decision.
just looking at how to without waiting for policy times, like looking at the end of the budget, the end of the year, at 8%. But how between then and that time, the first and the second time, looking at the budget, when can we do these aims to, if we need to go up to the 16%?
Yeah. Well, generally the way we have it set up now is those funds that come in that are unexpected, or wait till the end of the year for council to true up the budget and be able to make those decisions. For this year, we're holding everything. If it doesn't have a dedicated, funding source, it's a program that's not going to happen right now. That's anything discretionary to try to preserve those. We have extra money in the ending fund balance right now, but just as a reminder, we've got some capital facility projects that are mandatory, that we don't have a choice on. We're out to bid for a fire station. We'll know what those numbers look like next week on the bids, but we also have at a minimum a police impound building that has to be built, because we're in a similar situation there as we are with the fire station. We're in a leased building that's month to month with a landlord that we know wants to redevelop that site. So we know that that use is going to go away, and we're going to need to accommodate it. So we don't want to hesitate on that. So those are some projects that we need to do that are we don't have a lot of discretion on because we don't have another alternative. Jan, you
Jan
had
a question, Paul.
Oh, yeah, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to clarify something for Don. What we're talking about when you're talking the 1 month reserve, the 1.5 million, is an entirely different account than the 8% does that 1.1. So there's two different accounts that we have money in. One is 1.5 and the other is 1.1. I just wanted to make sure that you understand that it's two separate accounts.
Okay. Thank you.
Mike has a question.
Mike?
Yeah, I just have one general question because it was alluded to over some of the comments that were made. But is there a rationale for trying to increase your reserve funds when you're in a economic downturn, or do you wait to increase your reserve funds when the economy is on an upswing? In other words, I didn't quite understand the concept of increasing the reserve fund during our situation now with the economics being in a bad place.
No, I don't. I think you're on the right track, Mike. Is you wouldn't want to make a council policy that increases your reserve funds when you're in a downturn economy, because you're doing is you're forcing yourself out of compliance if you can't accommodate that. But as our economy returns, that's when we really want to start thinking about what those reserve funds look like moving forward, so that we're building them in the good times, and then when we get to those bad times, because we know that's going to happen, that we have just a better reserve fund policy to help redirect. The reserve fund's not going to save us in a downturn economy, which means we can't just keep going forward with business as normal and just use the reserve fund to balance it. That's a dangerous financial outlook. The reserve fund is we need that money to get us through, so we can redirect and change the course and down our resources, whatever we need to do to bring the city so that it's operating within its means. The larger the organization, the more time it takes for that to happen. You're also, like I said, you're dealing with, the largest revenue source for the general fund is sales tax, which is reported with a 2-month lag. So we're 2 months behind the 8 ball when we get those numbers. And so that course correction takes a little bit longer when you only have 1 month's worth of operating revenue. That's just, it's a kind of a thin line.
I think I would say that building the reserves is a council-driven priority, and that's what it has to be. So whenever that time comes, if we start to come back to a good time, that's something we hope the council will want to look at, so that the staff has more operating room with that 2-month delay. So you're not already 3 months into it with 1 month of cushion to utilize for the downturns. So.
Deborah?
So I guess I just would like to say that I would ask that Paul and Kristen and Mayor, I know you're an integral part of the budget too, that when it's time for the fall retreat, you would come with suggestions to council about strategically increasing the 2 different reserve funds or setting thresholds, or if it's time to do that, whether we need to wait till the following spring. But I want to make sure that we continue this conversation so we don't let the opportunity slip by us whenever the upswing does happen, hopefully sooner than later. Hopefully. Is that okay for me to ask that?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, right now we just have so much unknown. We're trying to present you a budget outlook for things we absolutely don't know.
I know, I get it. I feel that way in my own life with retirement, brand new, and so
But fall would be great.
yeah, thank you very much.
So on the next slide, just talk about some of the administrative goals, and that is to be in compliance with our reserve fund policy, staff retention. It's administrative's goal to retain staff and be able to provide the services to the community that we do at the current level that we're doing them. Having said that, we're going to maintain the hiring freeze until we're sure that the economy is in a position where we can afford to reinstate those positions or add new ones, and no new programs or projects without a secured funding mechanism. So we're really going to have to just look hard at those right now, and be sure that we do have a funding stream before we look at anything new. I wanted to mention this for council. This will have on your next slide is the property tax levy. It'll certainly be a discussion that we're going to have in October when we reconvene the retreat to look at the budget. We did bank the 1% increase for our property taxes this year, which means we have a bank capacity for next year. If that looks like something that'll be needed in the development of the 2021-22 budget, staff would bring that recommendation to council this fall for discussion. I just wanted to note that if we did take that bank capacity in property tax for next year, it'd be about $42,951 would be revenue generation off of that. So it could help with general fund expenses.
Probably also a heads up that I'm sure in October when Kristen presents us with a full budget, we will be taking that 1% for next year that we normally do. We just were having such good times last year. We banked the capacity, but I don't anticipate, unless some miracle happens, we'll be in that position this year. Mike had a question.
Mike?
Yeah, is there any thoughts about, you said you had a banked 1%, but then there's the 1% for this year. So does that then total up to 2%? Or is it possible to get the 2%? Not that you'd want to, but I'm just saying, is that also an option?
It is an option, and yes, that's it's a council decision. And as we build the budget, if staff thinks that's needed, then we'll bring it to council as a recommendation. Council can make a decision, but yes, the potential is there to take the 1% banked from last year that we didn't implement, in addition to a 1% allowable increase for the following year. So yes, you're right, Mike. Could potentially be a total of 2%.
So that would end up, am I on mute? No. So that would end up being closer to like $86,000 if we were.
Yeah, in round numbers, yeah. Plus new construction. So yeah, it varies year to year.
Yeah.
On the next one, looking at the budget calendar. So the budget development has already started. Kristen has been working on our assumptions. So she's looking at our labor costs and benefits and items as they come in. With Wendy's help, Kristen and I have meetings scheduled over the next several weeks with each one of the directors to talk about their departmental budget. That'll all get rolled up and reviewed with the mayor. And then October 3rd will be our fall council retreat, where we'll present a preliminary budget to council for discussion. October 26th, that preliminary budget will come to a workshop, be ready for the public at that point. We'll then talk about the proposed general property tax and EMS tax. November 2nd, we'll hold a public hearing on the general property tax and the EMS levy. And the public hearing, excuse me, on the proposed 21-22 budget. November 9th is set aside for a follow-up if needed. So if council has additional questions or wants additional discussion, we've just programmed a spot in there to be able to accommodate that. 16th, we adopt the resolutions for property taxes and adopt the 21-22 budget ordinance. And then we always have the amendments. That's kind of the last thing we have to do, is we have to true up the 2020 budget. We have to end the year on a balanced budget. So we true up any expenses that is usually arrived from capital projects that have come in, or grants that were unexpected. We'll review those amendments on the November 23rd and have a public hearing and council consideration for adoption on December 7th. So it looks like it's early this year, but just the way the Mondays fall, that's the schedule that we had to put together to avoid having to meet on Christmas Eve, but that's always an option. If we need to, we can add another meeting towards the end of December. Jan?
I have a question on new construction. So we've got, let's just say the Gateway Business Park. At what point do they start paying property tax? After it's all completed and there are businesses in there, or are they paying at least some along the way? Because we've got a lot of very, very large construction things going on. And I'm just curious.
They pay on the property values of the property. So even though there's nothing going on there other than bare property, they still pay property taxes on the unimproved value of that property. The improvements come in when the county assesses it and then begins collecting taxes on the improvements.
So like Coca-Cola and Smart Cap that are done on 59th. So at some point the county comes in and then it's taxed?
Yeah, but based on on their approval for occupancy. Once the building has been approved for occupancy, it's that's the effective date of it being on the tax rolls.
Yeah. Oh, okay, real good. Thank you.
Kristen had a...
Yeah, just to clarify, I don't know if I have the date exactly right, but I think the assessor goes through September 1, I think is their cutoff of every year. So whatever happens to be on the tax rolls as of September 1, say for this year, then would be certified for tax rolls for next year. So I don't know if I have that date exactly right, but they do have a cutoff point, and I think it's August, September.
We can take a break. Any other questions on that? Mike,
you're on mute still.
Okay. On the non-discretionary costs, I was just curious. You have contracts based on population. I can think of a couple, but what are some of these contracts based on population that you had in mind when you jotted that down?
The Puget Sound Clean Air Agency is one. Mm-hmm. The Disaster Emergency Management System is another. That are paid on a per capita basis, billed on a per capita basis.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Not knowing for sure, you know, these, especially in the Zoom retreats, are always hard to figure out how much time we need. So we got through this in about an hour of this part of the presentation, and it was meant just to have some dialogue with council and kind of prepare us so that you know what was going to happen leading up to October, when we really have the more solid numbers and have a preliminary budget to present to you. I thought that well, another thing we could do here is that, like I alluded to in the beginning, we've been working on the RFA. We're scheduled to have an update Monday night,
Steve, did you mention that council had some items in the budget category? Should we do those before we move to the RFA?
Oh, we can, yeah.
Well, Councilmember Ertley responded to my email with a couple of items that she wanted to speak. I'm not sure whether they're budgetary related or just general questions or things that she wanted to have discussed. So I've got that list in front of me, and Marilyn, would you like to just go through the list yourself and kind of let council know what you're thinking of, or you want me to start the conversation by identifying what the topics were?
Well, I think there were just three little items that popped into my head, and they aren't huge items. One of them is, but you know, I was just wondering about stop signs on Olympic, you know, which isn't a huge expense, but it is something. And I pretty much got my question answered. I think that Paul, Sarah Lopez let me know that you were working on that. And let's see, what was the other? It was about the park at Smoky Point using park mitigation money. I didn't know how that factored in with the status of our budget. We had talked about potentially purchasing land at Smoky Point for a community park. And so I don't know where we're at on that. And there was one other thing. I don't have my list in front of me.
The other item was new crosswalks in town.
Oh, yes, we have the worst crosswalks ever. So I was wishing that we could all get together and have a painting. No, if we could hire someone to do it. No painting parties. You guys aren't in.
I know we budgeted for that this year to do the crosswalks.
I know.
I'm just guessing at this point, it's got to be a staff capacity issue.
It isn't part of staff capacity issue. There was some concern with the crosswalks. We did budget for it, and we actually to do some painting. You know, one crosswalk was done as a test on second, excuse me, and the paint didn't hold up very well, but the concept was good. And then we had kind of a wrench thrown into that that we were trying to sort out because there's been some concerns in the traffic world that Jim could expand on much better than I can about painted crosswalks being more of a distraction to drivers. So I did check with WCIA, and they're kind of taking a conservative attitude towards that, of course. But Jim, do you want to elaborate on the painted crosswalks?
Both Ryan and I went down to a training seminar which specifically focused on pedestrian safety. And one of the things they spoke about is discoloration or non-standardized crosswalks. People are not used to them, and they can be, if somebody gets hit in there, they can be a potential liability exposure to the city. So WCA, at the end of the meeting, they recommended strongly against anything that was far from normal. Having two white 18-inch thermoplastic lines and maybe a colored inset that is a high contrast to the white lines, that might work, but nothing that is going to be out of the ordinary.
That's absolutely fine with me. I just look at it as a safety problem because it's really when it's either raining or it's dark in the mornings too. I know the one there by where the railroad tracks used to be, and it goes across Division. I mean, we painted strips along there to make it look more visible, but I just worry. I don't care if you just paint white stripes on there. That's fine, but it's a safety problem. I look at it as. And it looks uncared for and run down. So I don't need flowers and, you know, gorgeous stuff on there. I'll find another place for that. And then we'll just paint some white stripes or something to make it safe.
Yeah, I agree. Ours fall into the category Jim first mentioned of being faded out and non-standard. So I think they're already in that category. Anything we can do to increase pedestrian safety.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
We do have some paint, and I would not mind doing, like Jim said, the contrasting color in between the white lines. It has been a bit of a, we're a little shorthanded on staff right now, but I would like to get that wrapped up, or at least get a few of them done. So
Council work party.
yeah, if you want to work.
Yeah. Well, with the stop signs, I understand there's one going to go at Lebanon and Olympic, but the one at First and Olympic, where there is no stop sign, that's now a 4-way because that new development, they come out there, and it's a weird area for the crosswalk because the crosswalk isn't exactly at the corner. It's slightly back or north. And so when all of those businesses are open and all of the, condos or apartments, whatever, are occupied, there's going to be a whole lot more traffic there. And right now, people don't walk up and down the sidewalk on that side of the street because it's a construction zone. But soon there'll be a whole lot more people walking around there. And it just seems to me that that would be a logical place to make that a stop sign. I don't really care for stop signs. Tom said don't mention it because he doesn't like stops. He says there are too many stop signs.
At first, the traffic analysis has to be done anyway. We can't just put them.
No, I understand that, but I guess Ryan did a traffic study. They put the little things out that you drive over to count the cars and that. But my fear is that happened before it's occupied and open. So is there a way do they redo that, or do they just factor in when a bunch of more people move in and there's a lot more activity? Or do you have to redo the study?
The traffic engineering study is still valid. It was never finalized and was never signed and stamped. And Second Avenue was completed. The traffic study was signed, and that has been issued out for a work order. We're printing out the First Avenue, Maple, and Olympic traffic engineering study, and that will be signed and issued out to M for installation of the stop sign by the end of the day.
How about First, where Marilyn was talking about?
Yeah.
First and Olympic? Did you do a study on that intersection?
No, we did not.
Let's add that to your work plan and have take a look at that, since there is a new building in there with both residential and commercial.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be really a good idea. That's going to be a very busy area for pedestrians and cars. And you can't see out of there because the cars park along the street and you have to inch out there to try to see if somebody's coming. And it's a challenge at times. So I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Again, with Fourth, there needs to be a traffic parking control so that people do not park that close. It's against state law to park that close to a corner.
Right. Well, they do it.
None of the curbs are marked to let people know that.
Anyway, it would be nice if we could get that fixed.
And I did want to mention on the crosswalks is a conversation that Jim and Sarah and I have had just recently was, because Marilyn, I think you were talking about the trail too, where it crosses Division, and we were talking about Division and Burke being two of those intersections that the traffic on the trail is increasing, and not only during the summer, but it's year-round use. So we were looking at the opportunity to maybe put one of the flashing light systems in for those crosswalks, because they are unique and it's a heavy use in there. So that's been added to Jim's work plan for next year. Until, we'll be seeking out some funding for that, hopefully.
Okay, is that like what they have up at the hospital? Where you push a button and it flashes?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it'll be more of a standardized, won't be like what the hospital has. It'll be more of a state-approved rapid rectangular flashing beacon type system.
Okay.
They're going in at 204th roundabout.
Oh, okay, good.
Does that address your questions, Marilyn?
Oh yeah, I still don't know about the park. It seems like it's doom and gloom, and we're
I
talking.
don't think we have an answer for that yet. I think there really has to be more analysis and more looking at it. And, we didn't even know what the purchase price would be on the one part of the property. So I think that, Mark is going to have to continue to do some research on it. I don't know what it'll look like. We'll have more information about revenues coming in. So I think we can discuss it again. I just would say, I wouldn't put a pin on that that's going to happen. We just need to do more research.
I was just wondering about the mitigation money and the park, money that is designated for park.
It's definitely a unique opportunity for us. And we all recognize that that's not an opportunity we'll have long term, but we want to be careful and look at, we have a lot of other parks to maintain too. We're losing grant revenues and things like that are declining for things, how we care for some of our other parks. So I really appreciate the staff taking a balanced look at that, making sure we don't do something and then we have 5 parks we can't take care of. So we just have to balance that and make sure we've looked at that.
Yeah,
M&O is a concern of mine, just because we were able to, as the economy increased, we've been able to really work through all the other department, take a deep dive into their resourcing, and M&O was kind of the last one on the list to get through. And with the help of James, we've been working on their maintenance plans and making some improvements within that helps them operate better, more efficient, so we could get a better idea of what their resource needs are. But we weren't really able to implement too much in there. And now, we're looking at, potential downturn in our revenues. And then to compound that, since March with the COVID, we lost our DOC crews, which we relied on very heavily for vegetation control, particularly. And so we've had to juggle crews around to be able to just keep our head above water with some of that vegetation removal. And so it's really been an eye opener as to how vulnerable we are when we're rely on outside resources that we don't always control, where they're at. In addition, we've got a few parks. I'll name Evans as being one. We've tried over the last few years to get some grant money to help us redo that park. It was actually built years and years back as a community project. So everything in there was put in with wood poles, which are coming to the end of their life. It's concerning to me because we need to replace all that, and we just have not been able to, get a grant or the revenues together to be able to do that. And I'd hate to lose that park, and have to shut it down because it's not safe anymore.
We had gotten $60,000 commitment from the county for their REAP funds, but they have pulled those all back this year. So that they gave it to us and now it's been taken away.
Well, my concern was I wasn't pushing for a park at Smoky Point. My concern was that we had recently had discussions about that, and it was kind of a priority. But to me, the bigger priority is maintaining what we already have. But again, I just wondered where everybody's at with that, because we've had, for, the last 20 years at least, we've talked about some kind of a park there, community.
It's still in the works. Mark is working on it, and I've been in communication with him. So we're.
Okay. Yeah, I talked to Mark a lot about it too. So I just wanted everyone to be aware.
Michelle's got her hand up.
Michelle,
Don had a comment, and then Michelle.
So it's Marilyn, is that an account specifically for park maintenance or purchasing new parks? Or, is that the only thing that those funds can be used for?
Some of it, Kristen can answer better than I, but it's when you have park mitigation money, then that money was set aside for park, and then the park board and council voted that it would, like when we sell, if we sell part of the York property, that money would be dedicated toward another park at Smoky Point. Mm-hmm. So it's already been, voted, earmarked to do that. And whatever other money comes in through park mitigation. I don't know how you take it for something else, an emergency, you just do it, or how's that work?
No, I think it has to be used for park amenities. It can be upgrades to parks. It can be new play equipment, or it can be the purchase of a new land for a new park.
Okay, well, I just, like, if it's already dedicated for that, is it possible?
I think the issue is we don't know what that purchase price is. We don't know if it's more than what we already have in the fund, if it wipes out the fund completely and you're not going to do any park improvements until you build that fund back up. There's just some, unknowns, just like with our budget right now.
Right, but I think Michelle's wondering if you can use that money for anything else.
No.
Yeah,
No.
just those uses, just park.
Park mitigation funds are restricted to park use.
So then it would be to upgrade, fix whatever's not going so well on existing parks, or as Marilyn was talking about, if there's land available that we can afford to buy to create a new park, we could use it for that.
Yes.
And Kristen, isn't it also true that it has to be for capital purposes? So you can't use it for maintenance on existing parks?
I
Right.
believe that's true. Yes.
You could replace play equipment. That would be a capital purchase.
Correct.
Don, Vanny, you had a comment you'd like to make.
Just back to Maryland's, the stop signs.
Oh.
Did I hear correctly that there is going to be a stop sign placed at Olympic and Maple?
Yes.
Okay. I just noticed too here within the last week, that same intersection really brought concerns up with about a stop sign, because I see they're going to be putting an ice cream parlor there.
Yeah.
So
Lots of activity, I'm sure.
so that brings me back to here. Last year, I went through the lovely town of Snoqualmie, and at their crosswalks, they have the push button thing at the crosswalk that has an actual stoplight that stops the traffic for the cars that are for people that are going to cross the street. And it's only like a 20-second light that turns red for the people to get across, and then it goes back to green. So I don't know if there's like a grant or something that might be available out there where we could use something like that for that type of
Stoplights on Olympic Avenue?
Hey, we used to have them.
Yeah, we did.
We used to have them, believe it or not. But no, I think that would even remedy some of the blind spots where people are trying to cross the street with put a stoplight there, and they push the button and it turns red for 30 seconds or whatever for them people to get across the street. And the rest of the time when nobody's using the crosswalk, it's green. It's
not like a regular signal light. It's just to allow cars to have to stop while the pedestrians.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just basically like a red and green. Stop the traffic and get the people across the street, and then it goes back to green.
It could be worth looking into just to see.
When I thought of that down there, when I seen that ice cream store, I'm thinking I could just picture cars parking over in the parking lot and running across the street.
We did add it to Jim's work plan for to look at least the 2 trail crossings. So that'll give us an idea if there's pedestrian safety money out there that's available, and what type of lights you can put in what areas.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting when I seen that just being used as a crosswalk.
And those improvements are also fundable by the multimodal fund that we get as part of our MVT bonus.
Deborah?
Oh, I was just going to be an advocate for Jim too. That something I learned on with transportation is it may seem simple to put up a light like that, but you have to do all due diligence ahead of time.
Oh yeah.
Studies and all the engineering things and stuff, or else we get in big trouble. Am I right, Jim?
You are so right. And I think Mr. Pfeiffer would be also right, standing right behind me on that.
So
it's a big liability.
What seems like we could do in just a month's time if the world was ran by you and me, Don, takes a little bit longer. So
yeah, I know that, but it's just got to start the process somewhere.
Exactly, I agree with all of it.
We finished up a little bit early. We have some time left. So at the beginning of the presentation, I kind of talked about the RFA, and there are some financial considerations there that I think would be helpful for the council to think about in the context of budgeting. And since we're talking about that, what I propose is we take a short break, and maybe I could talk about that for a little bit. It is scheduled. We were going to do it Monday night at council to give a briefing, but I think since we're talking about budget and that's in the forefront of everybody's mind, this would be a a good time to use up the remainder of our time to talk about it, if that's something you council would like to hear about.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
break.
Okay, so we're just gonna take about a 2-minute break in case you need to use the facilities or get more water or something, and then we'll come back.
All right, 2 minutes. I'll start my stopwatch. That was the 2-minute signal just went off. So it seems like we have a few council members who haven't yet rejoined us. So we might wait until they're back and visible again.
We had to bring our own snacks this retreat.
Yeah, no chocolate. Deborah's eating healthy.
I'm trying. I just was on 2 weeks of vacation. So lots of ice cream at the beach and stuff. So I'm trying.
Waiting for Michelle and Jessica.
Jessica's there.
Okay, there's Jessica. We can go ahead and restart to keep on
Okay.
time.
Yeah.
Paul, before we launch into the RFA, I guess I'd like to ask the question of council whether they have any other parking lot items, thoughts that came up that they wanted to mention at least before the end of the retreat. Any of those matters you want to take up before we turn to the RFA? Seeing no hands go up, it's back to you, Paul. We'll talk RFA then.
Okay. So the RFA committee is just, they had their last meeting before the break. And so the thought on it here was we've been trying to give the council as a whole an update monthly on the progress of the work that the committee's doing. But since we were coming into the break, we'd kind of go back and try to look at everything that the committee's worked on since the beginning. The latest thing that we've tackled is finances, and that was one of the reasons I thought, well, maybe this would be appropriate to talk about a bit today. But I'll go through quickly. We can follow up on this stuff Monday also. And Marilyn and Jessica can jump in if I miss something and add to it. So we've done some information on our website about why annexation, why are we looking at this as a possibility. Public outreach plan. Council, we talked about it at the workshop this week. A Monday night council will consider an agreement with Liz Loomis to help us with public affairs and public education as we move forward to a potential annexation. The committee has worked through things like the transition plan of how Arlington would move into the part of North County, what the boundaries would be. Of course, it'd be the existing boundaries of North County and then adding just the city limits. The departments that we contract to, presumably those contracts would be renegotiated with North County Fire for the contract services. The name of the organization would be North County Regional Fire Authority. However, the equipment within the city would still be identified as Arlington Fire Department. So we wouldn't lose that, our own fire station, our own fire department. Start date has been something that we've had to work through, where our intentions was to, if the annexation was approved by the voters, that it would start January 1st of 2022. That would be the effective date where North County would start tax collections. And so it made the most sense to start those together. However, we learned just recently that the county is requesting notification making the effective date August 1st. That becomes a little problematic when the effective date is before tax collection begins. So I'm still hopeful that we can work through that, and that is not the case. But if it is, what we've been talking about is the need to transfer the balance of the fire and EMS budget August 1st till the end of the year to North County to fund the fire district until they get tax collections beginning January 1st. That's what makes it problematic about not having the same start date as the same tax collection date. Services that they would provide are basically the same services that City Fire Department does now: ambulance service, fire marshal, inspections, and then the contract services. Governance. Currently, North County has a board of 6 fire commissioners. We would add 3 to that board temporarily, so there would be 3 appointed seats from the City of Arlington's council initially. And then through a process of elections, the 9-member board would be reduced to a 7-member board, consisting of 5 districted positions and 2 at-large positions that could come from anywhere in the district, which would include the city limits of Arlington. 2 of the districted positions would be dedicated. There would be districts within the city limits of Arlington. 1 would be within the city limits of Stanwood, and 2 would be in the unincorporated area of the district. Now, having said that, it's based on population, and we'll have some preliminary look at that. The North County is putting that together, what the districts would look like via an outside vendor. So we'd be able to look at that. Now, potentially, some of those districts could extend from city limits into rural area just to balance the population out, but dominantly they would come from the city limits. Does that make sense? Standards of coverage, we would maintain the same standard of coverage. So the services that our citizens see now would not change with the RFA, meaning response times and service levels have to be the same. And then we get into some of the financial considerations. And hold on to that for just a second and come back to that. We have some labor concerns to work through. Is that we have two, currently the organizations, of course, have two collective bargaining agreements and two different locals, which have to be folded into one. So those conversations have started at a higher level, so that the chiefs, I should say, have been working with labor representatives to start those conversations in the hopes that we could have that in most of the concerns ironed out prior to the effective date, so that we really fold the organization into one collective bargaining agreement upon or shortly after the formation. Let me see. Transfer of employees. So all employees of the Arlington Fire Department would transfer to the RFA. We had that caveat, it would be all employees in good standings. We don't have any employees now that are not in good standings, but that just reflects that should an employee be in the process of a disciplinary action, that carries forward into the transition, meaning there's no, nobody's slate gets wiped clean. So if there's a disciplinary issue, it transfers to the organization, to the new organization. Outstanding, we have left retirees. We talked a little bit about that at the workshop earlier this week. Our conversation was we have to form a left one retirement board now that our population is over 20,000. Will also be a conversation that we have to work out with the regional fire authority of what happens to those left one employees that are from the fire department. Does that liability transfer with the fire department, or does it remain with the city? We just haven't worked through those details yet. All of the, on the financial side, all of our financial considerations are based on a 7-year window. So what we did is we looked at a sustainable financial model for 7 years for the RFA. And we looked at 8 different models. So we took from just folding the organization together as it is up to what it would look like if we implemented additional positions into the fire department. And so we modeled all of them, and we came up with 2 financial models that actually were feasible, that were in the black. And so some of the elements of that is the transfer of assets. So we've worked through the majority of the assets and evaluated those transfers so that our rolling stock and equipment and stuff is evaluated, and the city gets some credit for those assets that are being transferred over. We also looked at the liabilities associated with that. So one liability is our employee liability. We have, vacation time, accrual, sick leave, and things that are due to employees upon separation, which becomes a liability when we transfer those employees to the regional fire authority. So we established a $596,000 liability there that would need to be transferred to the RFA. Does everybody have their sheet that I emailed out yesterday as part of this report that you can follow along? Because that makes it so moving down, that's the second item is that, so we have option 1 and 2, and I'll skip to the end of this really quick and just say these 2 options as far as financially go are the same. That the amount of money is virtually the same, that the cost of the city moving into the RFA, because when we ran the 8 different scenarios, there's no way for the RFA to stay in the black without the city infusing some cash into the RFA. They rely on their property tax twice a year, so they hold a fairly large reserve fund in order to be able to carry the organization in between their tax payments. The city annexing into the RFA doubles the size of the organization, which causes a need for a larger reserve fund to be able to make cash flow. So just wanted to kind of preface with that as we move through this. So employee liability was one issue that on both scenarios are the same. However, the difference between the scenarios is when that cash comes due to the RFA. So it's based on, as we move through this budget process and we come back to you in October with our proposed budget for the 21-22 biennial budget, and what those revenues numbers look like, and our ability to be able to pay North County, kind of is dependent on which scenario works best for us. And this is really based on what works best for us, whether it's option 1 or 2. Station 46. With Station 46, what was proposed in these 2 scenarios is that the fire station itself has a greater value as a facility than as a fire station. It's not a very viable fire station. However, it is needed to provide the services to the community right now. So the proposal here is that the city would maintain the debt on Station 46 and title to the building. The RFA would utilize the building for a period of time until they could build a facility of their own that would be more suitable to cover the expanding area. However, they would be responsible for the utilities and maintenance. And we just estimated it a 7 to 10 year, not knowing exactly how long that would be right now. So essentially they just utilize the building. When they were done with it, it would revert back to the city for a different, to be utilized as a different use.
So that the no rent would be for however long they chose to use it?
Right.
No end date, no
Yeah.
cap on that?
At this point, we haven't negotiated a end date. Yeah, and the rent piece, we've had some discussion on that, and one of the issues with that is, like I said, is that this is based on, these 2 scenarios are based on cash flow and what the RFA needs to be able to stay in the black. The RFA operates in the black currently, and so it's what is the minimum amount really that the city equity has to put in to allow the RFA to maintain operations in the black. And so anytime we change those variables, so if we charged the RFA rent for Station 46, that would change their expense categories, which would mean somewhere that money on the other side, the revenue side, would have to come out. So it would just mean that we would have to pay more in to keep the RFA in the black.
Is there a possibility though that you can, for the first 7 years while they establish that stability of their cash flow, but if they go out for other levies and things, then that there could be some other trip point where, if they were successfully to do levies to raise their levy lift,
Yeah.
then that would be put into a place where they would pay for the rent.
Yeah, that is certainly something that could be negotiated.
Deborah and Jan had questions, I think.
Just as I'm listening to this too, I guess just as a policy thought of caution, I don't want to see us get into situations like past with the contracts that we've had and trying to filter through all that? Because I feel like when those contracts were first made in the 90s or 80s or whenever it was, there was no end dates. There were no. So I just want to make sure we don't repeat that type of a situation for the future of our city.
Yeah, agreeable. And this with Station 46 is kind of a unique, it's a unique situation because we, to backpedal, we knew that, when we renovated Station 46, we knew that it was not a great fire station, but at the time it was something we could make work, that we could afford to do, knowing that someday it wouldn't be a fire station anymore, but to get the best use out of it, we did the renovation so it could be used as another type of facility. For instance, it's set up to be offices, so you could move office function in there. You could move a department of the city, another department in there. You could lease the building out as office space. You could tear the truck bays down and create parking to sustain the use, or put some commercial use into it. So it has other viable options that makes it more valuable than a fire station. So for instance, if we just asseted it and turned it over to North County, the value of it as a fire station would be much less than what the value of it is as a facility. So I hesitate into counting it as an asset because I don't think the city would get its true value out of it doing it that way. So it's a very unique way to do it, but that was really the reasoning behind it.
Steve, did you have a?
I think Jan had a comment.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jan.
I actually have two questions. My first one has to do with Station 46. So at some point, if that goes away and is not a fire station, will North County build or put another fire station that's in downtown Arlington? And then my second question is quite a ways back. You mentioned 2 captains. So I guess I have concerns. Does that mean that Dave gets to stay as fire chief here in Arlington? How is that going to work?
On the staffing, I didn't say anything about captains, not intentionally.
No, chiefs. You said chiefs. I'm sorry, I meant chiefs. You said there are 2 chiefs right now.
There are 2 chiefs right now, and what I was referring to is that each chief is Dave, of course, is the chief here in Arlington, and John is the chief in North County, and we have 2 bargaining agreements. So the chiefs together, along with the representatives from each bargaining agreement, have started conversations on what that looks like to combine the locals into one. Because if the annexation takes place and the organizations come together, we're going to want them under one collective bargaining agreement. So
I understand that, but what about the chief position?
The chief positions, they both remain in the interim, in the transition, and then the idea behind it is that Dave, of course, would end up being the chief over the RFA, over the whole organization. But in the interim, there would be 2 chiefs.
Okay,
there's a lot of operational work that has to happen to bring these organizations together.
But if it were to happen and they're all together, then Dave would be the fire chief for the RFA, correct?
That's what's planned, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Station 46, will they build another one here in Arlington, in downtown, or will we just lose it?
No, that's been the conversation. It goes back to the response times in the agreement. We're controlling that by saying that we have to have the same level of service, that we can't have a reduced level of service, so that we can't annex into the RFA and then the RFA can't close the fire stations and respond from a different location, because that would reduce our service, and that is not part of the agreement. The agreement is we have to maintain the level of service. So that's the amount of, the staffing that's needed and the response times. As for the fire station being in downtown, that hasn't been a discussion, but I'll say highly likely that it wouldn't be, because the part of the problem with that fire station is the location and how hard it is to get to its service areas from there. I would imagine it'll move. It won't be on that street. What'll happen is they'll do, they'll do some engineering on response times and service area, and they will pick out a geographical area that makes sense for a fire station that can serve the population that it needs to serve. And then also looking at population increases in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Don, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just, back to like what Barb mentioned too about having a timeline on it. I agree 100% with that, because I mean, right now, the way it's worded, for the remaining useful life, somebody could drag the remaining useful life out until the walls and ceilings are dropping in.
Yeah.
So, but no, I agree. We should have a 7-year, some type of a deadline on that thing.
I don't think that's unreasonable at all.
Yeah.
So we'll definitely work towards that.
Michelle, did you have your hand up?
I did. So I recall at another meeting we had that Dave wouldn't retain his position as chief. Did that change, or did I not understand that correctly? Another time I thought one time that you wouldn't, and then somebody, I'm not sure who it was, would be overseeing the RFA.
Well, no, I mean, structurally, I don't have a org chart with me. Structurally, they both have to be there during the transition. I don't remember ever saying Dave would not be the chief. We can't have two chiefs when the organization first folds together. So there would be, some hierarchy there. All conversations throughout this, and Marilyn and Jessica can confirm this, has been that, at a transition point in the organization, Dave would assume the role as the chief, but we would need, both of them to bring this together organizationally.
It was presented to us at council. I remember I heard what Michelle heard because I was surprised by it.
Mm-hmm.
It was presented that John would be the chief and Dave would learn under him. John's very short time until retirement, and then Dave would be trained after the operations had come together to step in the role. Did I get that right, Chief?
You did. Thanks, Barb. So what John and I have talked about is I definitely have a learning curve in the RFA. Here in the city, we have a separate finance department, separate HR. And so those things they make my life easy in the city. In the RFA, those are all self-contained in the RFA. So I have a learning curve administratively. So I would be the operational chief. John would be the administrative chief. He has a retirement plan of roughly 4 years. And so once the RFA came together, I would run things operationally, learn things administratively in preparation for him to retire.
Deborah?
Oh, if Michelle has something more.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Barb, because what you just said is exactly what I remember hearing in another meeting when we talked about this. So I just wanted to get clarification on that. So thank you.
That's how my memory worked. That's what I heard. Thank you for clarifying, Dave.
Me too.
Okay, so Dave, please do not take this personal, because I think you're fantastic and that you've done an absolutely amazing job as our fire chief, and I have full confidence in your future, okay? But I'm just thinking, I hear council people saying this has to happen, and that's out of our jurisdiction. And James, maybe you can correct me if I'm incorrect, but that's an HR decision. And that's the board of the RFA, correct? Is they do the hiring and firing, just like here in the city, it's the mayor and Paul who do it. So I hate for us as a council to, in our minds, be overstepping our boundaries about insisting somebody be in a position. And correct, like I say, correct me if I'm wrong. And it's not that I don't want Dave in that position, but I feel like, is our conversation even correct in making that assumption?
I think what we were doing is looking for clarification on what they've talked about in terms of planning. I didn't hear anybody say they insist that Dave become the chief of the RFA, but I did appreciate hearing that they put a plan together so that that they can work together, because that will be essential.
And I think it goes back to kind of having an operational plan in place in terms of the transition, just like Paul talked about, having that kind of combine both of those collective bargaining agreements. I likely will be involved with council for the RFA and kind of the negotiation of that new contract, hopefully to have it in place before the merger would occur in August of next year. And so just like Dave is kind of talking about those different areas, they've sat down and done an analysis of kind of the institutional needs and their individual strengths and kind of what that game plan is. Those things could all change though, just like we're in a current budget crisis now, or Dave wins the lottery and decides he's not going to work there anymore. It is a decision that they would have to get there, when the time came. I think it is good to express the desire in a public forum of support for Chief Kraske, and I think he appreciates that. But I think it's so far out into the future, and unless you negotiated some specific thing in the RFA merger agreement, which would be very unusual, I think kind of just going with the plan that they have now is about as kind of far along as you'd want to go. And I think that's kind of the representations that Dave and Paul have made to me. So.
And it is a board decision. However, we start out with 3 members of the council on the board, and when it's all said and done, we end up with 2 district positions with the potential of 2, and then 2 at-large positions that could come from anywhere in the district. So we still have representation on the board.
Michelle had some more questions.
I just have a comment, just in case anyone interpreted it that way. I did not demand that Dave, take on that role. As a citizen and a council member, I'm just compassionate and want to make sure, just want to know what is going to happen to him, because you're such a valuable leader in our community. I just wanting to make sure that you're taken care of. So
thank you, Michelle.
I just want to make sure Dave doesn't try and take Kristen Garcia with him, because become dependent on that kind of help.
I'm more worried now that he won the lottery that he remembers who his friends are. So on the 2 scenarios, moving down the page, Station 48. And what we're showing here is this is just like I said, when we get to the end of this next page, you'll see that the numbers between option 1 and 2 are virtually the same end dollar amounts. What we've done is we've changed them around and kind of played a shell game here just to be able to make it work with different cash flow scenarios. That still the end result is to infuse enough cash flow into the RFA that they could stay in the black, but be able to structure it in a way that meets the budgetary needs of the city. So one aspect of it was to utilize debt on Station 48. So in option 1, the city would retain the debt. So we would make the debt payments for the first 2 years, which is the $686,000. That's just a mechanism of, rather than us having to pay that money out on day 1, we're able to stagger it for a couple of years and just help us with our cash flows. And when we looked at that, that worked with the RFA. The infusion was enough to keep them going, but gave us some flexibility. So that in that category, that's really what the difference is between 1 and 2, is just in option 1, we retain some debt as a mechanism to finance the cash infusion, and in option 2 we don't. We do talk about in here, because Station 48 is on leased land, it's on airport property, that there would be a lease due. The RFA would pay a lease to the airport for the land that the fire station sits on, and that there would be some maintenance costs, although we don't expect there to be a great deal of maintenance costs in that 7-year window, because it's going to be a brand new facility. There's a little bit of an opportunity there for the RFA to help offset some of that land lease, in that currently there's the airport pays the city for some fire and EMS services. So what we've talked about is that there'd be room to kind of offset that land lease to the airport with some contract for services for the fire and EMS on the flight line, which is areas that don't pay into leasehold taxes. So the flight line doesn't pay leasehold taxes. What's not leased for private use anyway.
They don't pay a property tax.
They don't pay leasehold like on the flight line. On the hangars, any property that's leased to a private entity pays leasehold tax, but the runways and taxiways don't. So there'd be some room there. The RFA would provide fire protection for some kind of a fee that would offset the land lease price. So then the end of this, as you can see, the total value of the contributions, that's all of that we've talked about, either in scenario 1 or scenario 2, is about $3.8 million. That's in part that is cash infusion and assets. So that's what the total value of it is. At the bottom, you can see in option 1, it's about 1.5 million in 2022 that the city in actual cash pays to the RFA. And then in option 2, the cash contributions is a little bit higher because we didn't have the offset from Station 48, but it's spread out over 2 years. So I know that's a lot in a big hurry to go over, but I wanted you to have that in your mind. Marilyn, Jessica, is there anything that I missed from our conversations that you want to add to it?
It's pretty thorough.
So there is a difference in the cash outlay when you total them up.
Yeah, there's a slight difference.
Yeah, from 1.5 to 2.2.
Yeah.
What do I have to go back through there to figure out what that is? Because they kept totaling value.
If I may, I can answer that question. So the difference between the cash outlay is because in option 1, we're contributing less cash because we're keeping 2 years of the Station 48 debt. In option 2, we're keeping 0 debt, and so we're giving more cash. Yeah. So that's the difference.
686,000 shifts over.
That's the difference. Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
And really, and I don't want to throw more numbers out to confuse people, but we talked about the reserve fund and that need for cash flow. And so if you look at it this way, the RFA's current reserve fund minimum is $2.6 million. So presumably if Arlington joins the RFA, we double in size, and we would need to have $2.6 million in reserve fund, because that would be what their reserve fund would have to increase to be able to meet their cash flow needs. So when you take out those other liabilities that we've talked about, like the employment liabilities and things like that, it comes out to be just about what our reserve fund contribution would need to be. And so we're looking at creating equity, in that we're coming into the RFA with equity. We're not a drain on them, but the real driver here was to create a model where the RFA currently operates in the black, and when Arlington incorporates into there or annexes into there, they remain in the black. And I'll tell you, it's just, and Kristen can confirm, it's just barely in the black. And we really looked at hard. There is no increases in staffing to speak of. The increases in staffing, when we really modeled this out, the RFA came up with the same scenarios that we came up with in our long-range plan for resources for the fire department. We know we need command and control. Of course, when we annex in, that's a consideration for the RFA that they need to cover too. We know that our BLS unit is reaching saturation, and we're going to need to put another BLS unit, at least a peak call unit. When you model it as the RFA as a full, you come up with that same scenario. However, the way we model that financially is that BLS unit really funds itself. So we know there's a need there, and the chiefs are agreeable that when the need happens, the funds will be there to support it, because of course, adding a BLS unit when the call volumes reach that point, the transport fees would more than pay for the unit, as they do for us now. Our BLS unit supports itself and contributes to the rest of the EMS function.
Marilyn?
I would just say that this has been interesting, and going through the scenarios with our budget, and the possibility of having to perhaps raise property tax and do that increase, and all of these different things, maybe not doing parks, and cutting back, being as conservative as we can be, but yet when you talk about a property tax increase, this is also going to be a voter approved considerable property tax increase. And so it's kind of challenging times, I guess, with everything. This consultant that we're potentially hiring has an interesting job ahead of her to get the message across to the public, the need for this, and remain positive, because ultimately, if we don't have voter approval for this, we're going to have to really increase with our ambulance utility fee. And I know I've said this before, but it is very important that either way you slice it, it's more money for the public. So, it's a hard discussion when we're also talking about sales tax revenue being down and all this, not so good stuff. So challenging, I say.
So on paper, it doesn't look like, the RFA is marginally better than the sustainability we've been able to build for the city department. And it only gets there because there's a cash infusion from the city. Mm-hmm. So, I think in a broader context, this is a tough issue that covering fire and EMS, that it's just priced in a way that communities don't want to pay the price for it.
Well,
this wasn't the, how we heard with Marysville site, all this cost savings and resource savings that comes from combining things. Mm-hmm. I say this paper picture does not present that. Mm-hmm. It presents that it's just as expensive, only more so, over a bigger agency.
True.
Part of my facilitator role is to remind everyone that we're now a couple of minutes over time, and I think that's okay as long as everyone is willing to do that. Paul, are there any other items on the RFA that you wanted to cover today, or
that's
before
really
I ask?
That's really the extent of the material.
Okay.
It was just the questions and answers. I just want to make sure council's questions are answered to the best of our ability right now.
Well, let's have that a quick conversation, and I'll do a quick round robin with the council members in the order that they're displayed on my monitor, just so you know how I'm selecting this. May be different from yours. I'll ask Mike Hobson. Mike, do you have any questions either about the RFA or in general about the materials that were presented today?
I do have one question about the materials that we were presented. I noticed on them they had listed strategic priorities and objectives. You had a list of things that included affordable housing, and it was also things addressed on the strategic priorities pamphlet that we got. And so I'm just wondering if we have things, if the council members have things they want to add or take off, when does that take place?
Generally, we look at that at the spring retreat, and we we build on that based on, council's priorities. What I presented you today is more of our scorecard that just shows us where we're at on the ones that we did 2 years ago. I've kind of postponed making changes to that this time because it just didn't make sense to try to establish new priorities and new goals and create a work plan when we're in a budget transition that's we're not adding any programs or projects to right now because we're not sure about the revenues. So I guess what I wanted to, my commitment to council is that we're going to continue to watch the revenues, and the hope is that this it isn't as bad as we think, and it's not all doom and gloom, and it bounces back, or our revenues don't look that bad, and then when we get to our spring retreat next year, we have an opportunity to talk about new programs and projects because we're sitting in a good spot, and then we would kind of resume our normal
to look for new priorities.
Yeah, goals and new priorities.
The good news is it won't be a year since our spring retreat is actually happening in the middle of summer.
Yeah.
So did you understand that, Mike? We're kind of not, Steve kind of sent out the email asking if anybody wanted to add things to the list. We weren't engaging in updating priorities until we understood the financial picture of what we have to deal with.
Okay.
Jan, do you have any comments or questions for what was presented today?
I just have one, and I know Kristen is probably tired of listening to me ask on this, but under the non-discretionary costs, if when we do the retreat in October, is it possible to list out under public safety the jail costs, prosecution, public defenders, the medical costs? Because we pay for it even when they go to Monroe. And I really would like the whole council to see that list so that, I know Paul said it was 1.5 million, but I really think if the council can see exactly what we're having to pay every time someone is arrested in Arlington and what the citizens are having to pay for it, I'd appreciate that. That's the only thing I had.
Yes, and just so council knows, when we get to the October retreat, you will see a much more detailed and comprehensive look at the budget. We're just in the process of building that right now. So we were just kind of setting out the framework today, but yes, in October, you'll see a lot more detail and we'll have that information.
Thank you.
Marilyn, any last thoughts or comments?
No, it's been a great discussion. And I just, with regards to the RFA, I would say that of all the various projects or things that I've worked on, this has been one of the most, pleasant, easygoing, very nice people to work for, very considerate for Arlington, and very agreeable. I mean, you just couldn't ask for a better group of people that all have the citizens' welfare as their top priority. So I hope that our citizens will see this too and vote to approve the RFA when it comes.
All right, Deborah, any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, thank you for the update with the RFA. And again, to Jessica and Marilyn and Kristen and Paul for taking part in it. And I can tell how much better it's going than the previous discussion with the other cities. So thank you very much, because I know it's very time consuming and a lot of energy. I think it was last week that I sat through from MRSC, the COVID strategy budget class that they did. And so I was interested to see today with our topic for our budget of, how are we strategically thinking? And so I appreciate the work that all of you have done in presenting today. And I feel confident that whatever is coming to us because of COVID, that, you know, we've got the best people and the best plan possible, that we're able to slowly change course. I know we're not a gigantic ship, but we're a pretty big ship to change course. And so I have confidence in our team. And I'll look forward to, in the fall, any suggestions that Paul and Kristen and the mayor will bring to us, if we can just incrementally start planning for our future to raise both reserves. And I'm hoping that'll be so, that maybe things will be better than what we think. So just thank you for all the work. I really appreciate it.
All right, Don, your last thoughts, comments, if any.
Appreciate all the information we've been given, and it looks pretty good. I think that we stay on top of strategizing, staying on top of all the expenses and the things coming hitting us now and then. I think we got a good chance of surviving this wave. But no, I appreciate all the information we've been given. Looking forward to October.
All right, Jessica.
Not much to add. I agree with Marilyn. It's been a great experience and lots of really good conversation that seems to be a natural flow, and we can get deep and ask awkward questions, and there's no offense taken. It's been a really good experience.
Michelle, any last thoughts, comments?
No, thank you. For my first pre-budget, whatever we're calling this, in August, almost August. Paul, you did such a great job of outlining and explaining each item, but doing it in such an efficient manner. It left like me with almost no questions. So thank you so much for all the work and just your explanation of everything.
Thank you. It was a team effort.
All right, Mayor and Paul, any last thoughts or comments before we adjourn?
I have just one. I want to thank the council for a couple of things. One, that you've engaged in the financial understanding of the city for the past 10 years, you know, with the financial reports every month and trying to understand how the fund budget works. And I appreciate, because I know every one of you have thoughts and dreams and ambitions about how great our city could be and where we can add things to it and where we can build on what we have. But I also appreciate your attention to the financial situations too, and the grace to, you know, let us see what the future is going to unfold for us, you know, and we act fiscally responsible with that. So I just really want to thank the council for that. I feel very blessed to have this council to move through budget negotiations with.
All right,
Yeah,
Paul.
I just echo that, and thank you, council. I appreciate you taking the time out on this Sunday afternoon to listen to me for 2 hours. And thanks to the directors. All you didn't get to hear from all of them, but I asked that they all be on the call just in case questions came up. So they were quietly in the background. You know, you all know most of the time at the retreats, they get to participate and talk a little bit. This one's just unique because we're really was just preparing for the October retreat. So I appreciate their time, and we'll get more input from them next time when we have a retreat.
For those of you who didn't notice, Chief Ventura says hello. It's his opportunity to speak. I believe we are ready for a motion to adjourn then, whenever someone wishes to make one.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Hi.
Hi.
Meeting adjourned.
Enjoy the sun.